This is Chapter 3 of Serendipity Lost, Eden and Its Consequences by Mark Ajita. The first book of the Off-Course Texts, a series of philosophical reflections on the big here and the long now. Question: are you identifying what religions call the fall with the birth of our culture? Answer: that's precisely what I'm doing. The points of similarity between these two events have long been noted, of course. The fact that both are associated with the birth of agriculture, and both occurred in the same part of the world. But the difficulty in identifying them as a single event has been that the fall is perceived as a spiritual event, whereas the birth of our culture is perceived as a technological event. Daniel Quinn, The Story of B, 1996. Chapter 3, From Farming to States. So, we saw in the previous chapter on Spinoza that the original sin was choice, or at least a preference for one's own choices, even when new information or options came along, serendipitously. Stick to the plan. How did that become such a prevalent formula? How did we end up with rigid hierarchies, divine kings, slavery, and monumental architecture? All the planned rigidity and fragility that characterized the civilizations of certainty. Middle East journalist and historian Paul Kravachik writes eloquently of how the Eden writers rebelled against civilizations of certainty. In his book on the early history of Babylon's civilization, he points out that no band of hunter-gatherers can have simply given up all they knew and settled down to sedentary farming without engaging in a giant battle of ideas. Hunting and gathering have provided a relatively easy living. The new ways were, on the face of it, much harder and less rewarding than those that had served humanity so well for so long. To the author of Genesis, the Neolithic Revolution signified the fall of man. Civilizations of certainty, though, viewed the rise to dominance of their own way of life as the ascendancy of divinely ordained leadership, a blessed arrangement of technology, and divinely privileged domesticated species, grains usually. Kravachik points out that the momentous change to agriculture as the basis of life can only have been driven by the spread of a powerful new ideology. Religion made this happen. As we will see in this chapter, there was this flawed conception of divinity that facilitated obedience to the command of kings in the civilizations of certainty. Now, early Judaism, by contrast, was built upon the recognition of a grand catastrophe at the center of all of this. The Jewish storytellers attempted to narrate the disastrous consequences of the beginnings of agriculture that gave rise to the early civilizations of the Fertile Crescent. The first few chapters of Genesis are the result. Genesis depicts the dawn of agriculture not as the foundation of magnificent, unique societies, but as the failure of humankind in a Pandora's box of troublesome environmental miscalculations that came along with the beginnings of history itself. For those who, like the first Jews, were coerced or convinced to labor in agricultural societies, the difficulties imposed were endured for entire lives and for generation upon generation. As humans went from living in roving bands that rarely grew beyond 200 in number to settlements and then cities that by 7,000 years ago managed populations in the hundreds of thousands. Residents in these growing societies suffered all of the ills that large population centers today still suffer from. Furthermore, also lacking in many costly and difficult technological infrastructure solutions that today make cities livable. The leaders of these early complex societies had to find ways to naturalize this situation in the eyes of their subjects. The religions of these first civilizations of history were paramount in making the organization and planning of great agricultural societies seem natural. Their audience, the target of religion, were those who were forced into obedience as laborers and soldiers. To the extent that they were successful in reducing uncertainty, at least over the timescales of decades or centuries, agriculturally minded societies increasingly ignored serendipity. Agriculture was not a success in the sense of making life better for all those who converted to agricultural life. Consider that in some of the most provocative passages ever written on the human transition from Paleolithic hunter-gatherer bands to full-blown agricultural, caste-based civilizations, geographer and anthropologist Jared Diamond wrote in 1993 that the success of agriculture was ironic. Diamond says, "With the advent of agriculture, an elite became healthier, but many people became worse off. Instead of the progressivist party line that we chose agriculture because it was good for us, a cynic might ask how we got trapped by agriculture despite its being such a mixed blessing. The answer boils down to the adage, might makes right. Farming could support far more people than hunting, whether or not it also brought down the average food per mouth. Perhaps the main reason we find it so hard to shake off the traditional view that farming was unequivocally good for us is that there's no doubt that it meant more tons of food per acre." For almost 20 years, Diamond has been at the forefront of articulating the political economic conundrum that agriculture represents for understanding the past and the future of human culture. More recent interventions have tried to complicate these kinds of formulations, such as might makes right, as explanations for the success of agriculture. But much of Diamond's logic is hard to dispute. Furthermore, for instance, he points out that the fundamental connection between agriculture and inequality is just as important to our present day as it was to early agricultural societies. We forget that agriculture also resulted in more mouths to feed, and that health and quality of life depend on the amount of food per mouth. Forced to choose between limiting population growth and trying to increase food production, we opted for the latter and ended up with starvation, warfare, and tyranny. The same choice faces us today with the difference that we can now learn from the past. Well, that judgment of agriculture's cataclysmic consequences for human societies remains a hotly contested point. It may come down to one's assumptions. Do you assume that we've made progress, or do you assume that we've gotten worse? And again, this is the whole problem of thinking in terms of paradise lost. We need to think instead in terms of serendipity lost. Less debatable is that with the emergence of large civilizations, human authorities took charge of the environment. They shaped, controlled, and projected force onto their populations. What resulted with the Neolithic turn to crop cultivation and animal domestication may have been a higher rate of sustenance for humans. On the other hand, though, the formula that gave rise to social complexity across the world was consolidation of economic control over the redistribution of agricultural surpluses. Agricultural civilizations built up concentrated control over goods, primarily food. Agricultural theorist James C. Scott incisively outlined the incentives that led from agriculture to large states. Given a choice between patterns of subsistence that are relatively unfavorable to the cultivator but which yield a greater return in manpower or grain to the state, and those patterns that benefit the cultivator but deprive the state, the ruler will choose the former every time. The ruler then maximizes the state-accessible product, if necessary at the expense of the overall wealth of the realm and its subjects. So it is that the pre-modern state attempts to so arrange its subjects and to sculpt the landscape around it in order to make it a legible field of appropriation. The cultivation of a single staple grain was, in itself, an important step in legibility and hence appropriation. That is, large states select only a small subset of what ingenious human beings are truly capable, primarily the social and material processes that it is capable of overseeing. So the irony that Scott is pointing out, as with Diamond, is that such societies were not utilitarian. They were anti-utilitarian. So why did agriculture work? Might makes right, as Diamond pointed out. Well, furthermore, I think that we can be fairly sure that agriculture primarily benefited those who succeeded in convincing others to allow them to control the surplus provided by increased production. Those who convinced others became priests and kings. Hierarchy in society was essential to implementing and enriching the human practice of environmental control that we know as agriculture. A society whose operation is contingent on the widely held consensus that its priests always know what they are doing ends up with values skewed towards privileging a small set of knowledges. The knowledges, functions, and enterprises that are privileged are those that priests can understand. Legible production, grains, as Scott pointed out. The state privileges the observations, acts, and outcomes that it is capable of achieving at the expense of all that a state cannot achieve. The religions of these certainty-oriented civilizations were inseparable from the process of privileging and maximizing state-accessible product. These societies ended up relying primarily upon a surplus of obedient labor in order to succeed. Stability was secured through the society's collective illusions that made human labor itself a legible field of appropriation. By contrast, in the earlier hunter-gatherer stage of human development, in order just to survive, constant, pragmatic flexibility was required. The time left for engineering unequal social groupings was likely highly limited. In the periodic times of surplus and leisure afforded to pre-Neolithic humans, after a hunt, a raid, or the discovery of a fertile glen or meadow, this leisure would likely have been shared amongst all. Thus the ability for a single group to maintain a monopoly over intellectual leisure, and in turn over religious intellectual. The dangerous aspects of agricultural states that our societies today still bear within them is the danger of imagining that the most powerful people in a society can see everything that matters to its people. Still, the problem is that with the rise of the first states, the management classes, the priests and priest kings, were provided with more than ample time to take every precaution to see that their cadre and their progeny would stay in control, regardless of the prospective adequacy or the continued efficacy of the social and material organization upon which their power was based. Putting aside debates that center around who is more violent, or smarter, more hard-working, more free, or even more egalitarian between hunter-gatherers and the agriculturally civilized, the main break from hunter-gatherer life that we inherit today is that complex agricultural societies were built on religious illusions, which aided the priestly classes in negotiating their interests with subordinate classes. We are still living out the legacy of a top-heavy society where imaginary rewards have been substituted for real rewards for much of the population. It is an organizational schema which is a bit like an upside-down pyramid balancing on a point. Everything skews to the functions that seem to serve those who command, rather than those which might discover how best to organize society in a way that is both durable and flexible. In imagining the economic motivations for processes that created the belief systems of certainty-oriented civilizations, an insight of Hank Paulson, Secretary of the Treasury, during the beginnings of the financial crisis of 2008. Paulson reflected back on the genesis of the crisis in mortgage-backed securities in the United States that led to the collapse of the investment banks Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns on the 5-year anniversary of the crisis in 2013. He explained that it was because of technological and practical innovations in financial management that the combined impact of many small shifts in the structures of investment and finance had been imperceptible even to Paulson until the crisis. It was not until the system of mortgage-backed securities had become unhinged that Paulson had to acknowledge that the model had changed. We had gone to a securitization model. Mortgages were sliced and diced, packaged into securities, and then sold in the public market around the world. Along with innovation came complexity, and complexity is the enemy of transparency. What is important here is the truth that complexity is the enemy of transparency. That formulation begs the question of how, from the religions of the earliest states to the advanced design of financial markets today, complexity may actually be built in and elaborated in order to defend hierarchical economic order from the dangers of transparency. Hence, the complexity of the archaic belief systems surrounding divinity in polytheistic archaic religions of the civilizations of certainty. Pantheons of many gods, complex ritual and calendar systems, and bizarre legal orders that enforced the roles of different classes. These would have served the function of deferring any efforts on the part of the public to push for greater transparency in the mechanisms of economic redistribution controlled by the priestly classes. The cultural means that were marshaled by the archaic religions of early civilizations to curtail economic transparency generated an endless diversity of deities, rituals, myths, and traditions. In terms of all of the aspects of what we today identify as religious culture, early agricultural civilizations elaborated cultural techniques that were specific to their distinct environments. This diversity of environments, ecological and cultural, resulted in vastly different symbolic, scientific, and artistic systems. It is an enterprise of infinite fascination for professional anthropologists and archaeologists, and for anyone who has ever visited a museum with a collection of ancient artifacts, to reconstruct these belief systems and attempt to fix the connection of their beliefs to the material reality of the populations who conceived of these deities and believed in them. However, the development of archaic religion in early civilizations was motivated by the need to facilitate the hierarchy of social connections. Priestly redistributive control over agricultural produce, mainly grain, was authorized by the divine reasons in the ideas, beliefs, and structures of archaic religion. The burgeoning elites of the first civilizations had to build societies and forge an overall unity out of thousands, and eventually up to 1 million people. However, the elite were charged with the task of maintaining control and organizing society in which most people were no longer attached by kinship, as humans had been to every other human they had dealt with for millions of years. Politics and the concept of the divine were deeply entwined in these earliest polities that agriculture enabled. Diamond, not long ago, described the challenge of transitioning hunter-gatherers to the hierarchical farming societies. As population densities of hunter-gatherers slowly rose at the end of the last ice age, bands had to choose, whether consciously or unconsciously, between feeding more mouths by taking the first steps towards agriculture, or else finding ways to limit growth. Some bands adopted the former solution, unable to anticipate the evils of farming, and seduced by the transient abundance they enjoyed, until population growth caught up with increased food production. Now, it may be that some bands chose agriculture. However, Diamond and many others seem to underestimate the role of culture in building agricultural societies. For instance, when Diamond claims that agricultural bands simply outbred and then drove off or killed the bands that chose to remain hunter-gatherers, because 10 malnourished farmers can still outfight one healthy hunter. It's not that hunter-gatherers abandoned their lifestyle, but that those sensible enough not to abandon it were forced out of all areas except ones that farmers didn't want. The idea that in every case agricultural bands simply fought off hunter-gatherers misses the process that must have gone on simultaneously. That farming bands found persuasive ways to convince other foragers to join up and take subordinate roles in the farming bands kind of society. Religion. The agricultural theorist James C. Scott's central argument about agriculture is that the measurability and predictability of domesticated cereals and the control hierarchies of human states are inseparably intertwined. The transformation from serendipitous foragers to tightly measured farmers was not a sudden one. Scott has been criticized for putting forward an overly simplistic theory of the state. However, he acknowledges that the reality must have been complex. There is no single moment when Homo sapiens crosses some fateful line that separates hunting and foraging from agriculture. From prehistory to history, from savagery to civilization, long before what many would consider proper agriculture, Homo sapiens had been deliberately rearranging the biotic world around itself, with consequences both intended and unintended. Thanks in large part to fire, it is clear on a long view that much of the world was shaped by human activity well before the first societies based on fully domesticated wheat, barley, goats, and sheep appeared in Mesopotamia. I think that what we can take from this is that agriculture was, at its core, the proliferation of goal-oriented behavior, choice, plans. The problem was not exactly that humans suddenly began to plan out of nowhere. Many other animals besides humans are capable of planning. Our ancestors had long made plans before planning became the enemy of serendipity. For millions of years, our ancestors made tools. To make a tool requires a plan plus skills. The first examples of chipped stone hand axes are dated to about 4 million years ago. Yet there must have been a tipping point, was there not? An inflection on the graph when someone somewhere in the Middle East made that step, social, psychological, and technological, towards what would become agricultural state building and irreparably breaking with the foraging past. This is simply the idea of Adam, the agricultural man at the tipping point, whose choice pushed goal-oriented behavior past the point of no return. Agriculture became a downhill battle towards civilizations of certainty. The agricultural reorganization of humanity ran against some long-standing instincts and capabilities to choose serendipity. The problem is that urge to have your plans work out all the time. If you're powerful, it's hard to resist mixing in some self-deception and some illusion-making. Next thing you know, you have a full-blown public relations regime in your ancient civilization. What is it that we talk about when we talk about civilization? How did this pattern then go on to take hold? What I want to lay out in the next chapter is that the driving force of this movement of reorganization in the millennia after agriculture, where social power expanded exponentially, was the increasing power of an elite, priests and kings. But priests and kings needed public relations in order to proliferate, in order for societies that were based on agricultural planning to proliferate. This massive cognitive reconfiguration of humanity took place by way of religion, and it was through the economic and political glue of certainty, illusory certainty, provided by religious ritual and its many and essentially arbitrary forms, that these states managed to expand, and they expanded in territory, population, and duration. Such a stable, top-heavy structure guaranteed a kind of feed-forward institutional memory. In the public relations regime of early civilizations, top-heavy hierarchical structure went hand in hand with institutional memory that suppressed serendipity. This has been From Farming to States, Chapter 3 of Serendipity Lost, Eden and Its Consequences. Up next is Chapter 4, Public Relations in Ancient Civilizations.